December 22, 1944. A cold wind rose off the channel, dragging the smell of salt and smoke over the French coast. The sea was restless, chewing at the ruins of a gun battery that once watched the horizon for Allied ships. Now the cannons were silent, their barrels crusted with frost, and the last of the German garrison had been marched away. On the narrow road above the cliffs, an American truck rattled through sleet, its canvas top snapping. Inside sat 7 young women in gray wool coats, their faces pale, their eyes hollow with disbelief. They had been captured only hours ago, Luftwaffe Helferinnen, trained to monitor radar and relay coordinates. Now they were prisoners of war, heading toward a beach that felt more like exile than Earth. The youngest, barely 19, pressed her hands between her knees to keep warm. She whispered, "Do they kill women too?" No one answered. The eldest, a former nurse named Hilda, stared at the wet floorboards and said softly, "They feed us first." Her voice was flat, factual, like she was describing the weather. The others glanced at her, unsure if it was comfort or warning. Through the gaps in the canvas, they saw the gray expanse of sea, endless and cold as their thoughts. The truck slowed near the remains of a fishing village. A line of tents stretched along the dunes, olive drab against pale sand, smoke rising from oil drum chimneys. An American sentry lifted the gate and motioned them through. One of the women noticed the absurd detail that the guard's gloves were too large. His fingers looked like sausages. She wanted to laugh but didn't. When the engine stopped, an officer waved them out with brisk politeness. "This way, ladies," he said in accented German, his tone light but not mocking. They followed, boots sinking into wet sand, the wind whipping their hair loose. They expected barbed wire, guard dogs, shouting. But what they saw instead was something that confused them. The camp smelled of coffee. A group of soldiers lounged near a makeshift kitchen, joking as they stacked crates. Someone had painted a Christmas tree on a fuel drum, complete with red bottle caps for ornaments. Across the path, an American medic wrapped a bandage around a local fisherman's arm. The women exchanged wary looks. This wasn't the face of the enemy they had imagined from radio broadcasts. A corporal handed them tin mugs of something steaming, cocoa, thick and sweet. One woman hesitated, sniffed, then took a sip. Her eyes flickered with something like shame. Back in Germany, she'd once told her younger brother that Americans drank chocolate while the Reich conquered Europe. Now the Reich was collapsing, and she was standing on a foreign beach drinking their chocolate. That night they were given cots inside a low wooden baraque, patched together from scavenged planks. The sea roared just beyond the dunes, steady as breathing. Through the thin walls came the crackle of a radio playing Bing Crosby's "I'll Be Home for Christmas." The irony stung. One of the girls muttered, "They send songs to men who kill." Another whispered, "They have voices that sound kind." None of them slept much. In the morning, frost glittered on the tent ropes. An American sergeant in a thick parka led them outside for roll call. He spoke little German but smiled often, and the women couldn't decide whether that was kindness or mockery. They were assigned light duties, peeling potatoes, washing tins, sweeping sand out of the mess tent. It was humiliating in its gentleness. They had prepared themselves for cruelty. Instead they found boredom. As they worked, they heard gulls and distant laughter from the beach. The soldiers there were hauling something from a small boat, crates that clattered and hissed as if alive. The women paused, curious. The Vietnamese-born cook, a short man with a warm grin, opened one crate and held up a creature that twisted in his hands. A lobster, its claws bound. The women gasped and stepped back. One cried out, "Das ist ein Käfer." A bug. The cook laughed softly. "No bug. Dinner." The soldiers roared with amusement, and even the sergeant chuckled, shaking his head. The Germans exchanged glances of disgust and disbelief. They had eaten cabbage stems and moldy bread in the last weeks of occupation. Now these men feasted on sea monsters? Hilda muttered. They eat like kings. Another woman replied bitterly. Perhaps kings who never learned hunger. Yet the smell that drifted from the kitchen was intoxicating. Salt, butter, wood smoke. Their stomachs growled. One of them, Anna, remembered her mother's warning during the lean winter of 1943. Don't let hunger make you forget who you are. She wondered if that still mattered. By afternoon the tide had drawn far back, revealing black rocks gleaming with seaweed. The prisoners were sent to fetch driftwood for the evening fire. The wind was fierce, but the air was alive with gulls and the crash of waves. For the first time since capture, they lifted their heads to look at the horizon. Across that endless gray water lay England, the enemy, yet also the place where peace might begin. As dusk fell, the cook gestured toward the fire pit. "Come, help," he said, waving his ladle. They approached cautiously. He cracked open a lobster claw with a hammer and offered a small piece on the tip of a knife. "Try." No one moved. Then Hilda, the oldest, took it. The meat was steaming, pale, fragrant. She bit carefully. Her eyes widened, then softened. She swallowed, exhaled, and said in halting English, "Not bug." The cook grinned. The others followed hesitantly, each taking a taste, their expressions shifting from fear to disbelief to quiet awe. The butter melted on their tongues. The sea's brine mixed with smoke. For a moment, the camp fell silent except for the crackle of the fire and the hiss of the waves. War, hunger, pride, all blurred into warmth and salt. A corporal watching nearby muttered, "Guess the bugs aren't so bad after all," and several soldiers laughed. Even the prisoners smiled faintly, a fragile truce forming in the glow of the flames. As night deepened, the women sat near the fire, hands outstretched to the heat. The sky was ink-black, stars veiled by low cloud. Somewhere inland, artillery rumbled like distant thunder, but here the sound was muted, almost forgotten. One of the women whispered, "Will it ever end?" Hilda looked toward the dark horizon and said, "It already has, for us." The narrator's voice would note with quiet gravity that none of them could yet imagine the years of captivity ahead, the interrogations, the long repatriation that would follow. But that night, on a winter beach smelling of salt and butter, they tasted something they hadn't known since the war began: gentleness. The fire flared, throwing sparks into the wind. One lobster shell cracked sharply in the pot, echoing like distant gunfire. The women flinched, then laughed at their own reflex. For the first time, the sound was genuine. As the last embers faded, the sea whispered against the sand, and somewhere in the darkness, a voice hummed the tune they'd heard the night before. "I'll be home for Christmas." The melody drifted between tents and waves, carrying a promise none dared believe. But when morning came, a truck would arrive with new orders, moving the prisoners inland, away from the sea. And the taste of that strange red creature would linger on their tongues like a memory of peace they hadn't yet earned. The morning tide had receded, leaving ribbons of foam stretched across the sand like white lace. The beach glimmered under a thin sun, and the camp stirred to life with the groan of engines and the clang of metal pails. Smoke drifted from the mess tent chimney, mingling with the cold scent of seaweed. For the German women held there this strange rhythm: coffee at dawn, orders barked in English, laughter beside the waves. Felt like some surreal dream halfway between punishment and mercy. Hilda stood by the water barrels, wringing out a damp towel. Her hands were red and rough, the knuckles cracked open from salt. She watched the soldiers moving with unhurried confidence, their uniforms loose, their voices casual. "They act like the war's already over," whispered Anna, beside her, sweeping sand from the doorway. Hilda gave no answer. She was still thinking about the lobster, the shock of its sweetness, the warmth it had kindled. It had unsettled her more than the capture itself. An American sergeant approached, his breath fogging in the chill. He was tall and freckled, with the easy manner of someone who'd grown up far from battlefields. He spoke in clipped German, awkward but kind. "We send you to France Center, next week," he said. "Bigger camp. More women, less sea." The way he said it almost sounded like a promise, though none of them knew if that was good news. Then he pointed toward the kitchen. "Work today, yes? Help cook." The women exchanged glances. Cook? They had cleaned, peeled, mended. But this was something else. Food was power, a language of control. Still, they obeyed. Inside the mess tent, warmth pressed close like breath. The Vietnamese-born cook, whose name they'd learned was Min, greeted them with a grin and a half-bow. "You help me, Ja?" His accent bent the words into something musical. Pots steamed on the stove. Buckets of gray fish lined the floor. At first, the women kept their distance, hands folded behind their backs. Min handed Hilda a knife and gestured toward the fish. "Cut. Head off." She blinked, uncertain. Don't know this." He demonstrated with smooth precision, then handed it back. She hesitated, then mimicked him, and the blade slid cleanly. The smell hit her, sharp, briny, and she flinched. "Not bad," he said cheerfully. "You learn fast. In war, everyone learns new things." His tone carried no bitterness. Outside, trucks rumbled past the dunes carrying crates stamped U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps. Inside, Min was humming an old French song as he boiled rice. The rhythm of his work was hypnotic. The German women found themselves falling into it, their movements guided not by orders but necessity. For the first time, they were not being shouted at, they were being taught. Anna dropped a handful of salt by mistake, and Min only laughed. "Is okay. Too much salt better than no salt." The simple forgiveness startled her. She had lived for years under superiors who punished the smallest error. "You laugh even in war?" she asked softly. "Especially in war," he replied. Later, as the sun climbed, they carried buckets of seawater up the hill. On the horizon, ships moved like gray ghosts. Word spread through the camp that Allied forces were pushing east toward the Rhine. The Germans listened in silence. Some whispered that their families might be in those bombed towns. Others dared not imagine. By midday, the Americans ate their rations on the beach, beans, bread, coffee, and the prisoners sat nearby with smaller portions. Still, the food was rich compared to what they'd known. Butter that actually gleamed, bread still warm from a field oven. The contrast gnawed at them. Their homeland starving, while their captors feasted. The sergeant, his name was Miller, sat on an overturned crate, watching them eat. He spoke to Hilda through a translator, asking where she had served. "Battery Sexton," she said quietly. "Radar post near Cherbourg." He nodded. "We took it 2 days ago." "You fought?" She hesitated, then shook her head. "We just watched the lights on a screen." He studied her a moment, then said, "Funny, huh? You watched the sky, we watched the sea. Both of us waiting for something coming." It was an odd conversation, neither friendly nor hostile, but something in between. Miller seemed fascinated by the women's calm. They seemed fascinated by the soldiers' freedom, their laughter, their lack of fear. Somewhere between them hung the absurdity of it all. Two sides that had believed monsters lived across the sea, now sharing salt air and soup. As evening approached, a storm gathered over the horizon. The air thickened with the scent of rain. Min began securing his supplies, covering the fire pit with a tarp. "More lobsters today," he announced. "Fishermen bring crate." The women stiffened. Anna murmured, "Again?" Min nodded with a grin. "You like?" They did not answer. The thought both thrilled and unsettled them. The lobster had become a symbol of something they could not name, a forbidden pleasure, an enemy's generosity. Hilda stared at the sea as thunder rolled. "We shouldn't enjoy it," she said. "It makes us forget." Anna turned to her, eyes hollow. "Forget what?" The storm broke just as the first pot began to boil. Rain hissed on canvas roofs, the sea churned gray. Min worked quickly, his face illuminated by flashes of lightning. The smell rose again, rich, buttery, defiant. The women gathered near the entrance, watching. The steam looked like ghosts lifting from the pot. Miller appeared, coat soaked through, carrying a basket of bread. "For the ladies," he said with mock formality, setting it down. "And for peace, maybe." Hilda frowned. "Peace?" He shrugged. "We can start small. 1 meal at a time." She looked at him, unsure if he was joking. But there was no mockery in his eyes, only tiredness, and something that almost resembled decency. Min handed her a small piece of lobster. "You taste. Fresh from sea." She hesitated, then took it. The flavor hit like memory, smoke, salt, warmth. She chewed slowly. For an instant, the war fell away. Anna watched her, then reached for her own piece. Around them, rain hammered the tents like applause. Miller raised his coffee tin in salute. "To the end of monsters," he said softly. None of them replied, but Hilda's eyes lingered on him. She wondered if he meant the war, or humanity itself. As night deepened, the storm quieted. The camp glowed dimly, lanterns flickering under dripping tarps. The women sat by the embers, their faces pale against the orange light. Min dozed in his chair, Miller smoked beside the fire, and the sound of the surf filled the silence. Anna whispered, "Do you think they forgive us?" Hilda shook her head. "No. But they feed us." A gust of wind tore through the camp, lifting the corner of a tarp. For a brief moment, they saw the ocean glowing faintly under the moon, restless and endless. In that silence, Hilda felt something stir. Not hope, not yet, but a strange awareness that survival might mean more than obedience. Then a flare shot up far down the coast, an orange streak against the dark sky. Soldiers rose, alert. Miller stood, scanning the horizon. "Signal from patrol," he muttered. The easy warmth vanished. Orders barked. Trucks rumbled to life. The laughter that had filled the beach hours earlier was gone, replaced by tension. The women watched as the men disappeared into the night. Only the sound of the sea remained, and the smell of lobster cooling in the rain. Hilda looked toward the horizon where the flare had burned out and whispered to no one, "Maybe peace is just another kind of storm." The storm had passed, but its memory lingered in the sand. Broken shells, torn canvas, puddles reflecting a bruised sky. Morning came late and uncertain, light struggling through clouds like a tired soldier. The beach camp felt smaller now, half-drowned, quieter. The German women moved about in silence, gathering scattered gear, wringing seawater from blankets. Each step left prints that the tide erased almost instantly. For the first time since their capture, they began to wonder not only when the war would end, but who they would be when it did. Hilda carried a crate toward the kitchen, her boots squelching in wet sand. Min was already there, his sleeves rolled, humming something soft in French. The smell of char and salt clung to everything. "Storm make camp clean," he said cheerfully. "Now only sea and sky." She didn't answer. Her face was drawn, eyes fixed on the gray line of the horizon. Min noticed. "You miss home?" he asked. She hesitated. "If there is one left." A gull screamed overhead, and both looked up. The war had become background noise, the thrum of distant artillery, the occasional drone of planes heading inland. Here, on this edge of the continent, everything felt suspended, as if the world had stopped to catch its breath. Yet beneath that stillness, something was shifting. The Americans were different now too, less relaxed, more restless. Rumors trickled through the camp like wind through the dunes. German counterattacks in the Ardennes, prisoners escaping, new orders to relocate. The women sensed unease in the soldiers' laughter, a kind of brittle energy. Miller, who once joked by the fire, now kept his rifle slung even while eating. When he passed Hilda that afternoon, he gave a curt nod. "You'll move soon," he said. "Truck convoy tomorrow." She frowned. "Where?" He shrugged. "South. Away from the coast. Safer, maybe." Then, after a pause, he added, "For both of us." The words lingered heavier than he intended. She wanted to ask why, but he'd already walked off toward the command tent. Inside the mess, Min prepared what he called a farewell meal. "Big pot, big stomach, big memories," he joked, though his smile didn't reach his eyes. The women helped without needing instruction. Their hands had learned his rhythm: stir, wash, cut, taste. It was strange, how quickly routine had replaced fear. Anna peeled onions until her eyes watered, muttering, "We'll go inland again. More mud, no sea." Hilda wiped her hands and said, "Maybe that's how it's meant to be. The sea forgives too easily." By late afternoon, the wind had turned cold again, slicing through the camp. The smell of lobster and fish soup spread across the dunes, carried far beyond the fences. Soldiers gathered near the fire, their faces tired but expectant. Min ladled bowls with careful precision, murmuring, Eat slow. Always eat slow when life moves fast. Miller joined them last, his boots caked in sand. He sat beside Hilda without speaking. They ate in silence, the kind that feels almost sacred. Around them conversation drifted. Talk of letters from home, of wives expecting babies, of the cold back in Vermont or Ohio. Hilda listened, astonished by how ordinary it sounded. War had always been a storm in her mind, something vast and impersonal, but now it had faces, voices, people who missed someone too. When Min offered seconds, she shook her head. No. Enough. He grinned. You save hunger for tomorrow. She smiled faintly. No. I save memory. Night fell blue and slow. Lanterns flickered along the beach. Somewhere beyond the dunes, a gramophone played faintly, an American tune, lazy and sad. The women sat by the dying fire, drawing their knees close. Anna broke the silence first. When I first saw the lobster, I thought it was a punishment. Something from hell. Hilda laughed softly. Maybe it was. Maybe that's why it tasted so good. The others chuckled, but there was an edge in the laughter, a shared recognition of absurdity. They were prisoners, yet better fed than the civilians in their homeland. They were enemies, yet treated more kindly than by their own officers. Every bite they took seemed to dissolve another layer of what they'd been told to believe. Later, Miller approached, carrying a folded piece of paper. Orders confirmed, he said. You leave at dawn. The women nodded wordlessly. He lingered, glancing toward the surf where the moonlight broke in silver streaks. You'll miss this place, he said quietly. Even the wind. Hilda studied him. Will you? He smiled without mirth. I already do. Then he handed her the paper. It wasn't the order sheet, but a photograph. A small snapshot of a woman holding a baby, smiling in front of a wooden porch. My wife, he said simply. She sent it last month. Hilda stared at it, unable to speak. The woman in the picture looked young, gentle, entirely untouched by war. She looks safe, Hilda said finally. Miller nodded. That's the point. He tucked it back into his pocket. That's what we're all fighting for. Not medals. Just that look. The wind rose again, cold and insistent. Hilda turned toward the sea, the sound of waves like breathing in the dark. For a moment, she imagined her own home, the smell of rye bread, the flicker of her brother's laughter, but the images slipped away. All she could taste was the faint trace of salt still clinging to her lips. The night deepened. Min cleaned his pots, humming softly. Tomorrow they go, he said to Miller. Maybe they forget me. Miller shook his head. People never forget the ones who fed them. Min laughed quietly. Then I live forever. In their barack, the women lay awake listening to the sea. The moon shone through a slit in the roof, painting silver lines across the floor. Anna whispered, Do you think they're good people? Hilda answered after a long pause. I think they're just people who have enough to share. Silence settled again, heavy but not cruel. Somewhere outside, a dog barked once and fell quiet. The camp seemed to hold its breath, as if aware that everything about it, the firelight, the laughter, even the strange red shells that had made them laugh, was about to dissolve into memory. Before dawn, Hilda rose and stepped outside. The air was knife-sharp, the horizon streaked with faint pink. The trucks waited by the gate, engines idling, exhaust curling into the morning mist. Soldiers moved about, checking manifests. Min stood by the kitchen door, holding a small wrapped bundle. When she approached, he pressed it into her hands. Bread, he said. For road. She wanted to thank him, but could only nod. Words felt too fragile. He added softly, You eat when sky turns blue. Always eat facing east. She didn't understand, but she memorized it anyway. Miller appeared beside the truck. Time, he said. The women climbed aboard, the boards cold under their boots. As the engine growled to life, Hilda turned back toward the beach one last time. The tide was rising, erasing the footprints they'd left. She felt the bread still warm in her hands, the salt wind brushing her hair, the hum of an engine pulling her away from the sea. And though she could not explain why, a strange thought entered her mind, that perhaps mercy was the rarest victory of all. The truck rolled forward, sand spraying behind the tires. Min lifted a hand in farewell, and Miller stood silent beside him, watching until they disappeared into the mist. Only when the sound of the engine faded did he notice something on the sand near the fire pit, a single cracked lobster shell glinting red in the pale light. He bent down, touched it gently, and smiled without knowing why. The convoy wound south along roads torn by war, through villages reduced to skeletal walls and shattered glass. The December sun hung low, casting everything in the color of ash. In the back of the truck, the 7 German women swayed with the ruts in the road, holding their blankets tight. The smell of fuel mixed with damp wool. No one spoke. Every few miles they passed fields pocked with shell craters, the ghosts of trees standing black against pale sky. To their right, beyond the hedgerows, they could sometimes glimpse the sea, a thin silver line that seemed to follow them, refusing to let go. By the second day, the trucks reached a larger compound inland, a transit camp near Cannes, built from old hangars and barbed wire. The place was efficient, impersonal, loud with orders shouted in 3 languages. Here the kindness of the beach vanished. They were tagged, counted, and separated into barracks by rank. The sea wind was gone, replaced by the smell of mud, smoke, and hundreds of bodies pressed too close. Hilda felt as though the air itself had thickened. That night, as rain hammered the roof, an officer read the camp regulations aloud through a bullhorn. "You will work, you will be searched, you will obey," he said in English. The translator's voice repeated the words in German, flat and metallic. Anna clutched Hilda's sleeve. "It's different here," she whispered. Hilda nodded. Yes. The sea was mercy. This is war again. Days blurred together. They cleaned latrines, carried coal, sorted uniforms taken from other prisoners. The rations were smaller. No butter now, only watery soup and black bread. Min's laughter, the warmth of the lobster fire, felt like something imagined. Yet the memory clung stubbornly, like salt on skin. Sometimes Hilda could still taste it. It wasn't just food. It was proof that humanity could flicker even in captivity. The conflict, however, was no longer external. It moved inward, between memory and survival, between what they'd been taught and what they'd begun to understand. Some of the women hardened, muttering that kindness from the enemy was a trick. Others, quieter, carried shame heavier than hunger. One evening after roll call, Anna whispered, "I dreamed of the beach again. I woke hungry for the smell of butter." Hilda smiled faintly. "Maybe hunger is what keeps us alive." 2 weeks passed before Miller appeared again. He arrived with a convoy delivering supplies. When Hilda saw him step down from the truck, his coat dusted with frost, something inside her jolted. Recognition mingled with disbelief. He scanned the rows of prisoners, eyes catching hers. "You made it," he said quietly. She nodded. "We did." He looked around at the overcrowded camp, frowning. "You're worse off here." His German was clumsy but sincere. "Command says food short." "But maybe I can." She shook her head. "No favors. Just not forgetting." He studied her face a moment, then pulled a small wrapped parcel from his pocket. "Bread. Real bread. From Cannes." He handed it through the fence. "You'll take it." Hilda hesitated, then accepted. The crust was warm, still soft. "Thank you," she said. "Not for me," he replied. "For whatever comes after this." Then he stepped back as guards shouted for him to move on. She watched the truck pull away until it disappeared beyond the barracks. For a long while she just stood there, the bread pressed to her chest like a letter she couldn't read. That night, she tore the loaf into 7 pieces and shared it without a word. The women ate slowly, reverently. The flavor, rich, clean, alive, was almost unbearable. Anna's eyes filled with tears. "Why do they feed us?" She whispered. "We were told they hated us." Hilda swallowed, then answered softly. "Maybe that's why they win." Snow came the next morning, thin flakes that melted on contact. The camp fell eerily quiet, muffled by the cold. Work details trudged out with shovels, but the ground was too frozen to dig. The guards stamped their feet for warmth. Somewhere, a radio crackled with news. The front shifting east, German lines collapsing. Some prisoners cheered under their breath. Others turned away, unable to process the meaning. Hilda stared at the sky, thinking of Min, of his instruction. Eat facing east when the sky turns blue. It was nonsense, perhaps, but she obeyed it in small ways. Turning toward the pale dawn, chewing her bread slowly, imagining the sea beyond the horizon. The war still raged, but in her mind she carried that night by the fire, as if it were a secret map back to humanity. One afternoon, a commotion rose near the gates. Trucks were arriving, Allied officers, new orders, movement. The prisoners gathered, tense and uncertain. A rumor spread fast. Some would be transported again, further south. Hilda felt dread twist inside her. Another move meant losing what little ground of memory she still stood on. The officer reading names shouted over the wind. Hilda Kruger. Her stomach sank. She stepped forward. You go with Group 12, he said. Departure tonight. As she turned to leave, a familiar voice called out. Miller was there again, climbing down from a jeep. Hold on, he said to the officer, flashing his papers. She's part of my intake records. I'll handle her transfer. The man frowned but nodded, too cold to argue. He led Hilda a few paces away, out of earshot. You'll be moved inland again, he said. But listen, this war's ending. You'll go home soon. His tone carried something between relief and exhaustion. She stared at him, unsure whether to believe. And you? She asked. Where will you go? He smiled faintly. Home, maybe. If there's still one left for me too. They stood in silence, breath steaming between them. Then he reached into his coat and pulled out a small object. Something red, curved, glinting faintly. A lobster shell fragment, smooth and polished like coral. Found this after you left, he said. Kept it as a reminder that enemies can share a meal. He placed it in her hand. Maybe one day you'll tell someone what it meant. She looked down at it, speechless. The shell was fragile yet solid, as if it had survived on defiance alone. You kept this? She whispered. War keeps us all, he replied. It's what we do after that decides who we become. A whistle blew, the convoy preparing to leave. Guards shouted. Boots clattered on gravel. Miller took a step back. Go on, he said softly. Don't look back. But she did. As the trucks pulled out of the camp, she turned to the fence, watching him fade into the snow. In her palm, the red shell pressed warm against her skin. She closed her fist around it until it hurt, until the pain became a promise. The convoy roared through the gates, engines howling, exhaust trailing like ghosts. Around her, the women huddled under blankets, faces drawn. None spoke. Hilda opened her hand once more and stared at the tiny fragment glowing faintly in the gray light. Somewhere far behind them, the sea thundered against the shore, unseen but unforgotten. She imagined the beach, the fire, the taste of salt and butter, the laughter that had sounded like freedom. And for the first time since her capture, she smiled. Not in surrender, but in understanding. The truck jolted over a pothole. A guard shouted for silence. Hilda tucked the shell into her coat pocket, holding it close to her heart. The road ahead stretched empty and white, leading toward a world that might, at last, remember kindness.